Queering the Queer Church, an observation and challenge for UFMCC's Central U.S. East Network regarding heteronormativity. I recently attended a queer theological ethics course in seminary. I was very excited to learn more about queer theology, theory, and ethics, especially because I'm affiliated with the Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches. I wanted to learn more about the history of queer theology and hopefully more about how to incorporate queer theology, theory, and ethics into my own context. One idea that stood out to me as I was learning more throughout the course is that UFMCC, the gay church, or more broadly, the queer church, isn't so queer after all. This disturbed me, and as a leader in the Central U.S. East Network, or cousin, as you'll hear me refer, of UFMCC, I feel that I need to address this, along with challenge my cousin friends to be more queer. In my observations, I want to bring to light several texts that I was reading during the course. In this presentation, I will draw heavily on Susan Cornwall's Controversies in Queer Theology and Marcella Altheus Reed's Indecent Theology, Theological Perversions in Sex, Gender, and Politics. You'll also find me pulling forth information from other queer theology, theory, and ethics texts written by Judith Butler, Patrick Chang, Michelle Foucault, Janet Jacobson, Claudia Shippert, Elizabeth Stewart, and Andrew Yip. First, let's begin with a couple definitions that will help you connect with my concern or argument. The definition of queer. Susan Cornwall says that queer is often figured as a phenomenon or methodology in a state of opposition or regulatory normativities. In an article by Elizabeth Stewart, Christianity is a Queer Thing, the Development of Queer Theology. She says that queer, then, is not actually another identity alongside lesbian and gay, but a radical destabilizing of identities and resistance to the naturalizing of any identity. So many people who identify within the GLBTQI spectrum will often think of the word queer as an identity, but what can be obtained in learning about queer theology, theory, and ethics is that queer or queering is actually something we do, as in a way to think about and literally turning the usual theologies upside down in an attempt to push up against norms. Claudia Shippert says in her article, Implications of Queer Theory for the Study of Religion and Gender, more recently, the seemingly ubiquitous definition of queer as resistance to normativity has been critically evaluated, and the implicit operations of norms within queer approaches themselves have found closer scrutiny. Then Susan Cornwall says, queerness concerns not as a homosexual resistance to heterosexuality, but a deconstruction of an unquestioned heteronormative picture, even by those who are themselves attracted to people of another gender. Another word, a concept that I will be focusing on, is heteronormativity. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary Online defines heteronormative as of relating to or based on the attitude that heterosexuality is the only normal and natural expression of sexuality. Janet Jacobson writes in her book, Love the Sin, Sexual Regulation, and the Limits of Religious Tolerance that heteronormativity describes the moral and conceptual centrality of heterosexuality in contemporary American life. Part of what makes heteronormativity so powerful is that it depends upon and works through a set of unconscious assumptions. That is, heterosexuality forms the basic idiom of everyday life. Believe it or not, we are submerged in a heteronormative culture. Regardless of the GLBTQI movements, the recent passing of marriage equality, and the numerous organizations that welcome GLBTQI persons, including Christian churches, including our own denomination, we have been affirming practices that have historically oppressed us. trying to look straight, hiding our identities, the notion that MCC can invite hetero persons into congregations just to intentionally be like heteronormative congregations. We are literally mirroring heteronormative congregations. But Marcella Altheus Reed says in her book Indecent Theology, this system of theological production has been, like many other markets, controlled by the North Atlantic production line of theology. The elaboration and choosing of theological themes and methodologies belonged, according to fashions and authority discourses, to Germans, USA, or British theologians. Heteronormativity is a paradigm of sorts. It is all around us and deeply ingrained in the human consciousness all over the globe. The dynamics of sexuality have shaped our society, constantly permeating the thought processes of humans, and it has become unconscious. We are so used to the way things are, we don't even notice that heteronormativity is ruling our culture. We think that sex is something that we keep in the privacy of our minds, within our intimate relationships. But sex is everywhere. The dynamics of sex and sexual relations are even in the church. And those of us who have experienced the UFMCC culture can definitely testify that sex is in the church. On purpose. It was, after all, the issue of homosexuality in the church that ultimately gave birth to UFMCC. Marcella Altheus Reed says, sexuality does not stay at home or in a friend's bedroom, but permeates our economic, political, and societal life. Theology has always been a great theoretical discourse on heteronormativity, describing sexual relations at home and in the public spheres of life. We are in a time where LGBTQI persons have been welcomed into heterosexual congregations. Yet, LGBTQI persons still struggle to feel welcome. It is true, there is an overall assumption in heteronormative churches that God, even Jesus, is a masculine, Caucasian entity. Even in African American and Black congregations, this is true. Christianity itself, even in cousin congregations, has not manifested so clearly. It is almost like cousin has mirrored the straight white church in worship styles, its traditions, its celebrations, its internal personnel structures, and only assign LGBTQI persons into the roles that are required for the church system to cycle. We may be queer persons in church, but we have yet to queer our churches. Susan Cornwall quotes Jeremy Corrett saying, Christianity tends to resist queerness because of its need to be confessional and lay bare truth about identity. Religion becomes queer when it breaks up the desiring self, when it refuses to confess an identity, when it refuses to say who we are, and acknowledge a plural self with polymorphous desires. To queer religion is to queer the foundations of theology, its monotheism, its monosexuality, and its monopoly of truth. Cornwall also says, what is disturbed by queering God is not solid theological truth, but a heteronormative distortion of God. Recognizing the veritable strangeness of God requires a willingness, also, to question assumptions about the structure and nature of culture and social interactions, particularly those grounded in norms or truths often considered unquestionable or incontrovertible. So even though we are LGBTQI persons inhabiting Christian congregations, we have merely adopted the same powers and principalities that have oppressed us for years, and we haven't even questioned it at all. Let me point out some cousin worship styles. What I've witnessed inside several cousin congregations is a replica of heteronormative tradition, style, and environments. What is most obvious is the lack of inclusive language in liturgy, hymns, and even in sermons. As LGBTQI persons, We should be pushing up against using he and king and master in our worship services. These are oppressive, and the language has been widely used against us. Alpheus Reed says, learning to see as a methodological step is in itself a sexual challenge for Christianity theology. Through influential systems including liturgies, hymns, and prayers, powerfully maintains the sexual metaphors of heterosexuality in their conditions of invisibility and pervasiveness. This invisibility is what stops us from questioning. Susan Cornwall says, the figure of Christ has been used as a weapon against non-Christian religions, and that a queer Christology must be vigilant to root out Christian imperialism. We need to reformulate our primary presence, our worship styles, environments, and even twist our traditions if we are to more fully represent being a queer body of Christ. In Susan Cornwall's book, she says, the queer consciousness seeks to critique heteronormativity and heteropatriarchal patterns of domination. This is where queer Christology intersects with biblical studies, for we can discern from Jesus' recorded words and deeds how he felt about power relations. I have to agree with Susan Cornwall in the matter of being so passive, even ignorant to the ways we worship, affirming heteronormative practices. She also says, to claim that all LGBT people who find mainstream liturgy unproblematic are simply failing to recognize how gendered, sexist, or heteronormative it is might be deemed very patronizing. It is problematic if queer people go along with being hidden, but if queer people behave more rather than less atypically in relation to their heteronormative church communities, if they flaunt their queerness, then this itself may contribute to their increased othering. If liturgical worship itself is to be queered, this must be a project of the whole congregation. Cousin churches have been affirming holy unions for decades. The celebrations have been the equivalent to weddings without the legal signature. I've attended many holy unions and weddings within cousin congregations, and what I have observed is they are the same as a wedding, or mostly the same as a heterosexual wedding. I can see where the creative aspects of decorating and themes of holy unions can be easily considered queer, but why are the couple's vows the same as they would be in a heterosexual wedding? Judith Butler says in her article, Critically Queer, to what extent, then, has the performative queer operated alongside as a deformation of the I pronounce you of the marriage ceremony? If the performative operates as the sanction that performs the heterosexualization of the social bond, perhaps it also comes into play precisely as the shaming taboo which queers those who resist or oppose that social form, as well as those who occupy it without hegemonic social sanction. On that note, let us remember that reiterations are never simply replicas of the same, and the act by which a name authorizes or deauthorizes a set of social or sexual relations is, of necessity, a repetition. Let me also bring in another sacrament, communion. I recently noticed that people within congregations struggle with the sacramental tradition due to the abusive natures of heteronormative conservative congregations from their childhoods. People I've sat next to, people I've witnessed from across the sanctuaries and cousin congregations are trying to fit in by accepting the sacrament of life, yet are having panic attacks because they can't escape their previous experiences inside heteronormative congregations. There's been so much shame thrown on GLBTQI persons that the act of confession and repentance during the Eucharist has created psychological distortion, inhibiting the ability to be grateful for the offering of bread and wine, juice in cousin context, and to be able to take it no matter who they were or who they are. Should we not be pushing up against the heteronormative sacramental practices? One last thing about what cousin churches are doing that I've witnessed is how we read scripture and tell or retell the biblical stories. We are not twisting any biblical truth while reading the scripture. We are reading it as it is, not questioning its use at all. What Susan Cornwall has to say about queer theology is not at all what cousin churches are doing. Just because we are GLBTQI persons listening and reciting scriptures does not mean we are queering our theology. She says, queer theology has been variously characterized as a theology of resistance to social norms, as by those who parody or reclaim the term historically used as an insult, a theology pertaining in particular to sex, a theology for lesbians and gay men, which seeks to justify their lifestyles, a theology accepting or endorsing a range of sexualities and genders, a successor to feminist and liberation theologies, a theology of deconstructionism, and a cynical attempt to twist the biblical truth about human sexuality. We are using the Bible just like our oppressors. Cousin churches will often affirm that the Bible itself is not the issue, but how it has been used against us. Very similar to what Andrew Yip says in Coming Home from the Wilderness, an overview of recent scholarly research on LGBTQI religiosity and spirituality in the West. He says, "The savage test is not the Bible. It is what Christians have made of the Bible. When the Bible becomes a savage text, the theology is proclaimed from what it is already faulty." Cousin churches can even say that we read the Bible from a different lens, yet we read the Bible just as it is and is used by our heteronormative oppressors. Susan Cornwall says, one of the things that queer theology has done so effectively, in common with feminist, post-colonial, and other postmodern theologies, has been to highlight the importance of individual location and context in formulating theology. That non-heterosexual people's experience qualifies them to respond differently and legitimately to the Bible was one of the foundational assumptions in early gay and lesbian theology. Cousin congregations have been known to retell the Christmas story just as it was told by our oppressors. We don't even bother to bend the story, queer the story. We just recite it and consume it just like heteronormative congregations. We have been programmed by society. We often do not even have the courage to change how the story has been told. Just like how Altheus has said, systematic theology leads us to believe, for instance, that the Christian dogma of the Immaculate Conception needs to be preserved and hegemonically cited and repeated. She also says it is difficult for people to see the sacred in their lives outside heterosexual parodies, repeated endlessly in the authoritarian structures of Latin American governments and societal patterns. The Virgin Mary was a girl, the angel was a boy, and God the Father, a father. The role of sexual stories in theology has been to repeat and reinforce heterosexual imaginations beyond naturalization processes by divining them, but also by concealing the questioning of reality and obstructing the creative imagination to find alternative ways of life. Now let me point out something more obvious in calling out heteronormativity inside cousin congregations. The structural themes within cousin. I will acknowledge that there are quite a few women leaders inside cousin congregations, specifically pastors. However, there is a presence of hierarchy, which I would consider to be heteronormative. And with that, there is a large presence of male leadership within these hierarchies. There's a large presence of gay men who head committees, worship teams, and the boards of directors. Some cousin members would say that this is because we changed from a grassroots movement to becoming an established denomination and took on practices and concepts that are originally found in heteronormative denominations. Like every 3 years we have a general conference where voting access is policed. Only certain qualified persons can participate in the voting. There are numerous practices to certify leadership, just like heteronormative democratic congregations. And these are just a few examples of mirroring heteronormative congregations. It's like we can't escape it. Altheus Reed says, heterosexual theology has found in its development the same problem and difficulties that people usually find in the sexual lives. For instance, issues of hierarchical relations, positioned bodies, and monogamic patterns of thought which tend to constrain and denurture people's lives. This may explain why we still emotionally and spiritually struggle with feeling like we are being nourished and nurtured by our churches. The paradigm of heteronormativity has infiltrated our congregations. Our queer theology is not enough. We are queer people in a heteronormative world and have been shaping cousin as heteronormative, just because that's what we've known, and what we have known to do to fit in, to appear the same or equal to heterosexual persons in this society. Susan Cornwall says in her book, "A truly queer God, who prefers the needs of the poor and marginal, has been displaced by mainstream theological heterosexual meta-narratives of desire, lack, and power. It is only in overcoming such ideologies that human beings can see more clearly the nature of God's solidarity with excluded persons. The first step for a queer theology must therefore be the indecency of the production of God in Jesus. There is nothing natural," she suggests, "about the concretized linking of theology with colonial, capitalist structures of power and legitimacy which play out in ecclesiastical and social structures of authority and decentness, but it is all too easy for those wishing to grasp or maintain ideological dominance economically to appeal to the controlling power of religion too. Many of us would search for the roots of these oppressive actions in order to start to untangle them. Where could we say this paradigm came from? Michel Foucault may have an explanation. He says in his book, History of Sexuality, Volume 1, what has taken place since the 17th century can be interpreted in the following manner. The deployment of sexuality, which first developed on the fringes of familial institutions in the direction of conscience and pedagogy, for example, gradually become focused on the family, the alien, irreducible, and even perilous effects it held in store for the deployment of alliance. An awareness of this danger was evidenced in the criticism often directed at the indiscretion of the directors, and the entire controversy, which occurred somewhat later, over the private or public institutional or familiar education of children, were absorbed by the family, a family recognized, restricted no doubt, and in any case intensified in comparison with the functions it formerly exercised in the deployment of alliance. Another insight may come from Claudia Shippert in her article, Implications of Queer Theory for the Study of Religion and Gender. She says, Lisa Dugan coined the term that has been called homonormativity, the emergence and analysis of a homosexual normative position that defends itself against queer others. I argue that these trends toward an idealization or perhaps assimilation of queer are dangerously problematic, and they certainly are contrary to the non-normative etymology and scholarly use of queer. Scholars rightly call for vigilance and a shift in attention to a different conception and function of normativity, especially perhaps within queer ethics. This direction of critique within queer studies is helpful to and needs to be considered in further development of queer approaches to religion and gender. And then she goes on to say, this new homonormativity, Dugan suggests, is a politics that does not contest dominant heteronormative assumptions and institutions, but upholds and sustains them while promising the possibility of demobilized gay constituency and privatized, depoliticized gay culture anchored in domesticity and consumption. So even with our own attempts in cousin congregations to queer theology and theological contexts have been shaped and infiltrated by heteronormative ideas. Janet Jacobson also has a good point. She says, what the shift from the particular question of homosexuality to the universal category sexual moralities accomplishes is the appearance that all sexual moralities will be treated equally, that is, in a neutral manner by the state. This is the liberal trick. In fact, one sexual morality, that which privileges heterosexuality, would be enshrined in the state, while any other sexual morality, including one that is neutral between hetero and homosexuality, would be delegitimated. This is state promotion established of heteronormativity. So despite our attempt as cousin members to be queer, we are not. And this may even further explain why we are closing down our churches and losing so many people in our congregations. People who leave the church never reconcile their spirituality or religious needs. They leave and lose their spirituality due to the MCC culture not being something truly affirming to their queer selves. We are continuing to oppress LGBTQI persons rather than liberating them. Elizabeth Stewart says, full liberation will be possible when the gay community learns the lessons of the early church, namely that it is only when we learn to stand in solidarity with other oppressed groups and engage in Eucharistic hospitality with those we regard as other. In the meantime, the gay community is constantly tempted by the places of Egypt, pseudo-liberation in the form of commercially based culture that turns gay people financially able to participate into collaborators in an oppressive economic system and ghettos, all of which can be quickly and easily swept away. With these examples, I found that heteronormativity has taken over the queer people of the church, of the queer church, thus making me believe that cousin is not so queer. There is less and less affirmation of queer matters inside the culture, even with the presence of leather, BDSM people with fetishes, transgendered persons, polyamorous relationships, and several other non-heteronormative lifestyles. I call for an indecent theology to remedy this. We must flip our theology and theological practices upside down in order to grasp what it is to be a queer network, even denomination. Let me tell you what Altheus Reed says indecent theology is. Indecent theology works here as a coming out process which consists of simply doubting traditions of sexual prepositions, a process that being public can be transformative political implications. So my challenge to cousin will be to look more closely at what queering means and to take note of all the heteronormative practices that we adhere to within our culture. Let's look at some ideas from the authors. Patrick Chain says, the very notion of queer is to denaturalize or de-essentialize formerly stable identities such as homosexuality, heterosexuality, race, nationality, woman, and man. And Susan Cornwall says, queering implicates all normativity and therefore means that no mossy rock of privilege or historic incontrovertibility can be left unturned. The point stands then that these concerns must also continue to speak to one another, with neither sex, class, racial, or economic privilege going unchallenged. Also think about Foucault and his notions of power. We are only balancing heteronormative power, but on the other end of the scale. Heteronormativity still has power, but now GLBTQI persons are reinstating it in their own context. Elizabeth Stewart says in her article, Christianity is a Queer Thing, the Development of Queer Theology, that Foucault argued that power was fluid and present in all parts of society and can be deployed by any group. Where power was exercised, there was always resistance to it, which itself was a kind of power. So let me point out what Foucault said about power in his book, History of Sexuality. Here are some things that Michel Foucault said about power. All the longer, no doubt, as it is in the nature of power, particularly the kind of power that operates in our society, to be repressive and to be especially careful of repressing useless energies, the intensity of pleasures, and irregular modes of behavior. He also says, pleasure and power do not cancel or turn back against one another. They seek out, overlap, and reinforce one another. Power is not something that is acquired, seized, or shared, something that one holds onto or allows to slip away. Power is exercised from innumerable points in the interplay of non-egalitarian and mobile relations. Where there is power, there is resistance, and yet, or rather consequently, this resistance is never in a position of exteriority in relation to power. Should it be said that one is always inside power, there is no escaping it, there is no absolute outside where it is concerned, because one is subject to the law in any case. Since power will cease to exist, we must try to transmute it and push up against the heteronormativity within our congregations. Thinking about Patrick Chang's ideas of multiplicity, middle spaces, and mediation. So he says multiplicity refers to a state of having multiple coexisting and overlapping identities as opposed to a singular identity. And for middle space, the middle space existence is never quite being at home. It is a state of being perpetually suspended in a third space between two poles. And for mediation, mediation refers to bridging function of bringing together disparate identities and ideas that would not normally belong together, rather than picking sides or reinforcing false binaries. A mediator finds common ground upon which both sides can coexist. So we will have to avoid tipping the scales of power, but rather try to balance them in order to attempt to become more queer. Ching says that queer people should take action and live into what it means to represent multiplicity, middle spaces, and mediation. We should queer the notion of what home means. Think about how we, as Christians, should try to live as Jesus would, do as Jesus would have, think as Jesus would have in order to reach full comprehension and affirm these notions. Ching says about Jesus Christ, as one who's both fully divine and fully human, exists in the middle space. That is, he belongs neither solely to the divine world nor solely to the human world. And he says, the rainbow theme of mediation, that is, bringing together resources, voices, and perspectives that are normally not seen as belonging together, is an important one for rainbow theology. In conclusion, I think we need to reevaluate what it means to be queer churches. So it is time to come out of the closet again. As Alphaeus Reed would say, God cannot be queered unless theologians have the courage to come out from their homosexual, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, transvestite of ideal heterosexual closets. There are plenty of resources on the UFMCC website that could help begin this process. There is literature on how-tos for all sorts of matters, like using inclusive language in our congregations, appropriate practices in being a trans-friendly congregation, And there's a list of literature about queer theology that can be shared with our congregations in group discussions. We need to affirm that we are already a body of multiplicity. We need to find the middle spaces, not the either-or spaces like heterosexual or homosexual. We need to mediate this process by bringing in other voices, not just those within our congregations. Once we have reviewed these notions and educated ourselves with queering resources, then we may be able to say we are actually a queer church. Let me end with a quote by Altheus Reed. Queer is not oddity. Queer is precisely the opposite. It is the very essence of a denied reality that we are talking about here when we speak of queering or indecencying as a process of coming back to the authentic, everyday life experiences described as odd by ideology and mythology makers alike.